All right, looks like it's recording. So go ahead.
Perfect. All right. So hello and thanks again. We have already thanked you enough, but of course, thank you so much for being here. I'm quite happy to present and to talk about secure multiparty computation. It can be quite of a buzzword because it's one of these things like differential privacy, homomorphic encryption, zero knowledge proofs. Like one of these things that like you can hear in a lot of places, but at the same time, it's like, okay, but is anybody like actually explaining them to me what they are about? Are they actually useful? Are they actually practical and all these things? So my goal was to disseminate the knowledge on this, which is why I started a series of talks on basic multi-party computation. Um, at the end, I'm going to provide a link to them. I think the techniques are actually fairly simple. And once you start working on them, you realize that if you want to prove security of things, if you want to be able to claim that something is secure in a more robust way, if you want to be able to give impossibility results and say, hey, this thing you're looking for is impossible and so on, then you have to get into theory, then you have to get into more complicated stuff. But if you just want to learn like the basic constructions, how is that they work, why is that this is possible in the first place, I think it's actually pretty straightforward. Of course, not super simple, but still like it's reasonably to do. And that's sort of the goal of this talk is to introduce you to what the topic is and what kind of things are achievable, what kind of things are not achievable, and some basic constructions that even though they will look super simple, they turn out to be the basis for a lot of much more complex and more efficient protocols. I am a PhD student on this topic. I work on cryptography and multiparty computation in particular on Aarhus University in Denmark. This is my last year, and I have been very happy to get to work on this field. But I noticed that there is no like effort from the community to doing like dissemination. So I think it's good also to push on that side. All right. So with that aside, I think I'm ready to get started. I'm Yep. So the title of the talk is a crash course on secure multi-party computation. And I would like to start with one single sentence that is supposed to summarize what MPC, multi-party computation, is. And I will define it as a set of cryptographic techniques that allows a set of parties to compute a function while revealing only the outputs. Each party has a secret input that it doesn't want to reveal to the other parties. And the goal is to get the output of certain computation, let's say the average of the inputs or the sum or something like that. So they want to compute a function without revealing the output. And in principle, this may sound like a bit contradictory, or at least like impossible, because if the function requires the inputs to be computed, how is that you could compute it without leaking the inputs themselves? And the goal of this talk is to show you, hey, it's actually possible. And here is a simple way to do it, or a couple of simple ways to do it, so that you convince yourself, hey, yeah, it's feasible, it makes sense. And then, of course, I'm going to provide some pointers to the literature so that if you want to continue reading about this, you can get some good ideas. All right, so the format for this talk is going to be a mix of slides and whiteboard. I'm going to use the whiteboard from time to time. Not a lot, actually, but I'm going to resort to it from time to time. And I think it's fair. You can interrupt me at absolutely any time. I think my hope for this talk is to assume essentially zero background, except for simple math and yeah, it's supposed to be very simple. At least I tried my best. So if there is something you don't understand, it's very likely that it's my bad. So I don't feel bad. I can try to re-explain, and that shouldn't be a problem. Right. And the last thing I want to say is that some of you may be more theoretically inclined, or also like the structure of things and mathematical definitions and so on. I want to state that the field is formal if you want it to be formal. So that we have definitions, we have theorems, we have proofs. But and of course, this is what makes the field complex and also beautiful, in my opinion. But it's not the point of this talk, so of course I'm not going to get into that. But we have those definitions, we have those concepts. In case you're curious, of course, we can discuss about this towards the end. Okay, so let's begin with the motivation for MPC. So consider this classical problem, which if you were learning about this at some point, you probably already faced it. It's like the flagship example we use in MPC. So consider two millionaires, Alice and Bob, and they are in the following situations. Of course, each one of them, they have some net worth, and they want to know who is the richest, but they do not want to leak the net worth to each other, because the most naive way of doing it is, sure, I mean, just send me your net worth and I will see which one is the largest, but they don't want to reveal by how much one of the parties is richer than the other one. So that's an example of multi-party computation. Two private inputs, and you want to compute a function. In this case, the comparison function, the function that says, hey, the first input is bigger than the second one, or the other way around. Another example is e-voting. You have, let's say, a very big town of 100 citizens, and they want to vote for the next mayor. So each party has like a vote, which is, for example, mayor A or mayor B. It can be a 0 or a 1 a bit. And the goal of the function is to compute the majority vote. So who won among the two or whatever number of candidates without leaking the individual votes. And of course, there is like a very naive way of doing it. I'm going to resort to the whiteboard. So there is a very naive way of doing it, which is if you have your participants here, these are the parties. Well, they just send their inputs to a trusted party. Here in the middle, a trusted third party, TTP, they send their input, their votes. So it's either a 0 or a 1. And then this party promises to compute the correct function and to return to the world after it has been done with it, the results. So it's going to say the winner is 0, for example, or 1. Yep, and it will promise several things. It will promise not to leak the inputs to anyone and to delete them, to erase them after it's done with the computation. It will promise to compute the correct function and not lie about the result. And it will promise to not crash in the process and actually give you the result. So this is, of course, makes sense. And in fact, this is how many things in our world operate. And it's fine. But the goal of MPC, in a nutshell, if I have to define what MPC is like a bit more formally, is literally to essentially do the same, achieve the exact same condition, but without having a trusted party in the middle. So this time, we're going to have each party has an input, but nobody else will know the input. It will never leave that party. Instead, there will be a protocol, which is a set of instructions that the parties are going to follow, so that at the end of this protocol, the output is going to be computed. So for example, the protocol may say, hey, party 1, the first thing you have to do is send to party 3 your input squared, for example. And of course, this is very stupid because this will leak the input towards P3, but that's an idea. It's like a set of rules that says, hey, send this data. Whenever you receive this data, send this other data. It's like a set of instructions. And whenever they follow those instructions, at the very end of the day, each party is going to learn the winner. That's the goal of MPC. So achieve the same as the trusted third party, but without having a trusted third party at all. And it turns out this is possible, and we will discuss some like the settings in which it's possible and so on. But this is the general idea. And if you're curious, this is in fact how we prove security. We are able to sort of show that the distribution that there exists in the real world is identical or is comparable to a distribution that happens in an ideal world where you have an actual trusted third party. So the goal of these protocols is to emulate what you will get if you had a trusted third party. Okay, so this is the goal of MPC. And when you say that something is secure, what do you mean by that exactly? So in the millionaire's problem, what we would like is that the net worth of Alice, it remains hidden from the view of Bob after they run the protocol, and also vice versa, of course. That's when you have two parties. It's very easy to define. But when you have more than two parties, like in the case of the voting that we defined before, it's not so obvious because, okay, I'm P1, let's say I'm P1, I'm one of the citizens and I have a vote. I want that my input remains secret to every single party, like every other citizen in my town. But maybe what happens if two of the citizens actually get together and coordinate in the execution of the protocol, trying to learn my input, or three of them or four of them? And to formalize this, what we do, we still would like to remain secure, even if many of the citizens collude. For that is that we define an adversary. So whenever I say adversary, think of this entity that is coordinating a subset of the parties. So in this case, for example, there can be an adversary coordinating these first three parties. So the adversary is here coordinating this set of parties. And it's coordinating them in such a way that the adversary knows what they're doing all the time, and it can instruct them to follow the protocols in certain ways and so on. And we would like the protocol to remain secure, even if these three parties work together under the let's say, under obeying this adversary. That's how we think of security. So the adversary will be like a party that coordinates other parties, like an entity that coordinates other parties, and we want the protocol to remain secure, even if those parties collude. So now the first half of this talk is going to be about, let's say, definitions mostly. So it's going to be about, okay, we consider these types of adversaries, these other types of things, and different taxonomies we have in MPC. And then I'm going to conclude the first half with some feasibility results and impossibility results. Like, okay, now that you know these definitions, this is not possible, this is possible, this is possible, and so on. So now we know what an adversary is. An adversary is an entity that corrupts a subset of parties. Why do we like thinking about adversaries? Because in cryptography, whenever you want to define security, you need some attacker, someone who is willing to break it. So in this case, again, we think of an adversary who is corrupting a subset of the parties. Okay, so in MPC, we like thinking of the adversary in different types. So for example, we can have what we call a passive adversary, and sometimes it's also called semi-honest adversary. And what this means is that the parties that are controlled by the adversary follow the protocol specification faithfully. So if you have a protocol that is secure against a passive adversary, what it means is that it is secure as long as the corrupt parties, which in this case are, for example, P1, P2, and P3, it's secure as long as these parties follow the protocol faithfully. Again, the protocol is a set of rules. It says whenever you receive this message, square it and do this thing with that and send it to this or that party. So of course, if it's profitable for you and if you're very bad, you may deviate. You may say like, I'm not gonna follow this rule because it's not good for me. I'm gonna follow this different rule. But a passive adversary will follow the rule, okay? And an active adversary, on the other hand, is an adversary that does not necessarily follow the rules. And of course, we would like to have a protocol that is secure against active adversaries. That's what we would like, because that's super secure. Even if the corrupt parties deviate arbitrarily from the protocol, then they will not be able to learn anything about the honest parties' inputs. But of course, as we will see, it's not that easy. Active adversaries is much more complex to handle. So we have, this is the first distinction that I want you to remember. Passive or semi-honest adversaries, they follow the protocol. Active or malicious adversaries, they can deviate from the protocol. Okay, we also divide the adversary in the number of corrupted parties that they can corrupt. Okay, so now some notation, P1 and PN will, P1 up to PN will denote the involved parties. So in particular, we have N parties. And let's denote by T the number of corrupted parties, all right? So we have multiple settings depending on what we allow the adversary to do. So the first setting is called dishonest majority. And the restriction there, the only restriction there is that T must be less than N. So essentially zero restriction. Why zero? I mean, the other possibility is that T is equal to N, but that would mean that the adversary is corrupting everybody. So everybody is corrupted. So we don't really care about that case, because in that case, the adversary knows everything. So the strongest case for the adversary is to corrupt everybody but one player, one participant. And in that case, we say that we are in the dishonest majority setting. And if you have a protocol that is secure in this setting, then you have the strongest privacy guarantees. Because that means, for example, if I'm participating in the protocol and I'm honest, like I know I'm not cheating or anything, then even if everybody else, absolutely everybody else but me, collude towards learning my input, they won't be able to do it because of the guarantees of the protocol. So that's like a very good guarantee, but it unfortunately is very hard to achieve and is less efficient. And of course, it gives less output guarantees, which we're going to get to that in a second, what it means. So yeah, this is the best world you can live in, where you can tolerate all corruptions. Like everybody can be corrupt except one party, and still the privacy of this party that is not corrupted is guaranteed. But that's too much to ask in some settings. Like some other setting that we consider is something called honest majority. And in this case, we require that T has to be less than N half strictly. So intuitively, the corrupted parties, the T corrupted parties have to constitute a minority. So therefore, the majority have to be honest, so non-corrupted. And in this case, you have weaker privacy guarantees because sure, your input remains secure as long as the adversary doesn't corrupt more than a minority. If the adversary suddenly corrupts a majority, so for example, if you are one of these 100 citizens, and if the adversary has 49 corruptions, then sure, the protocol will guarantee security. But as soon as the adversary gets one more corruption, then suddenly everything breaks. So this is not as secure as the previous one, but it turns out to be much easier to achieve, much faster, much more efficient, and it gives better output guarantees. Again, I'm going to clarify later on what this means. Also, I want to say that this is not a crazy assumption. Like if you think about some real world systems, just like, for example, Bitcoin or many others, like politics, governments in general, like it relies on the assumption that you have different parties and that like they cannot collude, they cannot control a majority. If some malicious party controls a majority of a system, then in many cases the security or the robustness or different properties will break. So if you have enough, like a large enough number of parties, this is totally reasonable to assume. So it's still very useful in many settings. And again, it's more efficient. So that's why we typically choose it also, because it's more efficient. And then finally, we also sometimes distinguish between this one. If we only require the adversary to corrupt at most a third of the parties, then we can get even better efficiency and even simpler protocols. But then you get weaker security guarantees, of course, because the adversary needs to corrupt less parties to be able to break the whole protocol.
How is
All right.
this related
Is there a question? Yeah.
How is this related to the classical Byzantine agreement protocols?
Yeah, that's a good question. So in general, MPC is this thing where you have parties with inputs, and then after some protocol, they get an output. And if you think of Byzantine agreement, or but like consensus and broadcast and all sorts of protocols in distributed systems, they have this syntax essentially. So you send the input. The input is, for example, like each one has a bit, and then the output of the functionality should be the same bit for everybody. Or the different guarantees you can get in distributed systems, you can model them as functions. In that sense, MPC is like a generalization of these primitives. So if you get an MPC protocol for arbitrary functions, in particular, this MPC protocol will give you a broadcast protocol or will give you a Byzantine agreement protocol. But the catch here is that usual design of traditional designs of MPC protocols makes use of broadcast, which in turn, of course, makes use of Byzantine agreement and so on. So it's related, like they imply each other in a way. You use Byzantine agreement and so on to get MPC, because in many MPC steps, in many protocols, at some point you need to make sure that everybody agrees, that everybody are on the same page so that they can continue. But also, if you have an MPC protocol, you can use it to get broadcast, for example, or Byzantine agreement. So that's how they relate to each other. Is that okay?
Thank you.
Absolutely. So I assume you also ask because we have this T less than a third that also appears there a lot, and hopefully it will become clear in a second, because we have some impossibility results that are rooted essentially in the impossibility of having broadcast for T bigger than a third and so on. So if you have seen that there, it also pops up here. All right. So now let's talk about types of security guarantees. So what does it mean for a protocol to be secure? As I said, let's keep that intuitive definition. It means the adversary, who is corrupting a subset of the parties, cannot learn the inputs from the other parties that is not corrupting. That's what it means. But what does it mean to like not be able to learn something? And in that case, we distinguish between three notions. So the first one is what we call computational security. And that's basically that privacy holds as long as certain computational problem remains hard. And if you work with cryptography in practice, you are completely used to this. So for example, in RSA, everything is okay as long as we cannot factor big numbers. With Diffie-Hellman key agreement, everything remains good as long as we cannot solve like discrete logarithm over elliptic curves or over different groups. So there are like, everything relies on certain assumptions that are well studied. And if your protocol relies on those assumptions as well, we're going to say that it's computationally secure. But in MPC, we have actually stronger notions of security that are not so common in practice, let's say in the real world or in the traditional cryptography. You don't see them so often, but they're actually present like everywhere. So one of them is what we call statistical security. And this one intuitively means that privacy holds irrespectively of the adversary's computational power. So no matter if the adversary is very powerful and it can break all the discrete logarithms in the world, it won't be able to learn the party's input. But if the adversary had access to many executions of the protocol, maybe it could learn. But of course, in practice, he only has access to a few. So that should be fine. So that's a statistical security is much better because it doesn't rely on the computational power of the adversary being bounded. And the last one is what we call perfect security. It's the best security guarantee that you may have. It means that privacy holds irrespectively of the adversary's computational power, and period. Like there is no chance that the adversary learns something. And if you are familiar, for example, with this encryption scheme called the one-time path, then you know what perfect security means. The one-time path is this scheme where you take to encrypt a bit string, you just XOR it with a completely random bit string. And the resulting bit string after the XOR is the ciphertext. And the reason why we say that this is Shannon secure or perfectly secure is because from this ciphertext, the plaintext can be literally anything. Like you can always show up a key that decrypts to absolutely every plaintext. So no matter how much power you have in the world, the ciphertext doesn't tell you absolutely anything about the plaintext. So that's what we mean by perfect security. And in fact, we can get perfectly secure protocols. Okay, thanks for bearing with me so far. Now we are reaching the end of the taxonomies. Like the last sort of category that I want to show to you is different output guarantees. So we also categorize protocols depending on the output guarantees. So what do you mean by output? So are the parties guaranteed to receive the output, or is the adversary allowed to learn the output before the parties, or like, yeah, what are the guarantees in regards to this? And it turns out that this is also important. So a protocol is said to have guaranteed output delivery, GOD, if the honest parties always are guaranteed to get the correct output, regardless of the adversary's action. So even if the adversary suddenly stops or starts sending bugged messages to everybody or does something weird, the honest parties will get the output. And that's very good in many settings. A relaxation of this is, okay, maybe the adversary can cause the honest parties to not get output. But in that case, the adversary won't get the output either, or the converse of that, which is if the adversary gets the final output, is because the honest parties also got this output. And then the weakest of all, which is the one that you may not desire for many applications, but as we will see in a second, you have to live with that because some applications can only get this notion, is security with a board. It means that for sure the honest parties, if they get an output, is the right one, but they may end up aborting. So they may end up getting zero output, like no output. Either case, the adversary will learn nothing about the honest parties' inputs for sure, but maybe the adversary learns the output and the honest parties don't. And that's very bad. Think about the voting scenario, for example. In the voting scenario, that if you have a protocol that only satisfies security with the board, it means that the adversary is able to learn who won the election. And based on that, say like, okay, Trump won, I don't like this. So let's make everyone abort. And after you make everyone abort, like the parties will not know what happened. Sure, their vote was kept hidden, but who cares? You still bias the election, right? So that's this notion at the bottom is not very good. Fairness is better because it means that if the adversary learned the output, then the honest parties also learned it. So either everybody learns the output or not everybody learns that. No one learns the output. Okay, so why did I take the time to introduce all this? First of all, because I think if you are interested into getting into MPC, like learning a bit more about it and so on, this is terminology that appears in papers all the time, and that is so common and so on that sometimes it's not introduced over and over and over again. So it's always good to have this sort of list of different notions that we consider. The other reason is because I want to show you now some known results. So what do we know to be possible? What do we know to be impossible? And this depends on all these things that I just explained. So let's start. I think if there is something, by the way, that you can get out of this talk that I hope to transmit to you, is this table that we're going to fill in here, because it gives you an idea about what kind of protocols are possible and what kind of protocols are just impossible. So let's begin filling in this table. So the first thing that I want to say is that for passive security, so remember, passive security means it's very easy to, okay, it's not very easy, but at least much easier to achieve than active, because in passive security, the adversary will follow the instructions of the protocol. So we don't need to worry about misbehavior. So when you have an adversary that is passive, it turns out that we can get the strongest output guarantee, which is guaranteed output delivery, simply by the fact that the adversary is passive. So the protocol, the execution of the protocol will just go as expected. Like nobody will send a bug message, nobody will send anything weird. Everything is supposed to go as everything goes as it's supposed to go. So we're gonna get the best output guarantee. Of course, if we get a GOD, we can get fairness and we get abort because all of them are weaker than GOD. This is not so interesting for a passive adversary. Of course, the protocols terminate if the adversary is passive, like everyone follows the protocol. The most interesting thing is the privacy guarantees. So the first non-trivial result, and non-trivial I denote here by a red color. It means that it's not trivial. It is that we can get a protocol if T is less than N with computational assumptions against passive adversaries. And if you think, for example, of N equal to 2, so you have two parties, let's say Alice and Bob, the two millionaires from before, and T equal to 1, this will fall within this category. It doesn't fall in this, it doesn't fall in this, it falls in this one. If you make the count like T equal to 1 and N equal to 2, doesn't satisfy this inequality nor this one. So it means that for the case of Alice and Bob, there is a protocol, assuming that the other party is passively corrupted. So the other party follows the protocol. There is a protocol, and that's good. So such protocols exist. And it turns out that if you want to achieve the same protocol, but with a statistical security, so something that is much more secure, and not only because it's much more secure, typically protocols that are perfectly or statistically secure are also faster because they don't rely on, you know, number theory or all these complex operations that you do when you have assumptions, lattices, multivariate polynomials. It doesn't rely on that. So if you want something that is much faster and much more secure, you cannot get it, sorry. And that's this impossibility result here. By the way, when I say you cannot get it, I mean, you cannot have a protocol that works to compute any function that you want. Of course, some functions may admit some protocols that are statistically secure, but you cannot have a general protocol that works for any functionality you want to compute. And if you cannot get it with a statistical security, of course, you cannot hope to get it with perfect security because this is even better than statistical. So this is the first set of results. Okay, what about honest majority? So now you relax the adversary. Okay, I just want my protocol to remain secure as long as the adversary can only corrupt a minority of the parties. So of course, we expect that things can be a bit better because we have less corruptions now. And indeed, that's the case. If you relax the corruptions to be at most a minority, then you can get perfect security, assuming that the adversary is passive, which means that you can get protocols that are completely perfectly secure. So this protocol, we're going to explore in this talk. And this protocol up here for T less than N, we're also going to explore. Of course, if you can get a protocol with the best security, then you can get protocols with the other two because they're weaker than perfect. So again, the black marks are implied by the red marks. And of course, if you can get a protocol for T less than N half, then you can get a protocol for T less than N third because here you have even less corruptions. So if you can support at most N half, you can support in particular at most N third. Good. So that's the panorama for the passive adversary. For the active adversary, it turns out that we can get security with abort if you are in the dishonest majority setting. So we're hopeful, okay, at least we can get security with abort. But as I said before, you cannot get fairness. More explicitly, if you want a general protocol that gets fairness always for any function you want, that cannot exist. But some specific functions may allow for this. But anyway, in general, you cannot get fairness. And in particular, you cannot get guarantee output delivery because it's even better than fairness. So if you cannot get fairness, you cannot get guarantee output delivery. Okay, but if you relax the adversary from dishonest majority to honest majority, so now the maximum number of corrupted parties is a half, now suddenly you can get guaranteed output delivery. So I guess the point that I want to make with when I jump from T less than N to T less than N half is that sure, you may want to withstand like all possible corruptions except one. That's intuitively the end goal. But if I tell you for a second, no, I mean, let's support at least a half of corruptions. Sorry, at most a half. If that's fine with you, we can get better things. We can get perfect security. We can get guaranteed output delivery. So it's a trade-off. You lose the number of tolerated corruptions, you decrease the number, but you increase other things. Of course, if you get GOD, you get in particular fair and abort. And also, if you get it for T less than N half, you get it for T less than N third because of what we discussed already. What about the privacy guarantees? Well, same as before. If you have an active adversary and you have T less than N, so all possible corruptions you have except one, there is a protocol, there exist protocols that give you security with computational assumptions, so relying on hard problems. And of course, because there are no such protocols for the statistical setting, sorry, for the passive setting, there cannot be such protocols for active setting with the statistical security. So you have to use computational assumptions. You have to use number theory, or you have to use some weird math, some well-studied problems to build your protocols. And of course, you cannot get perfect security either. What about the active case with t less than in half? This is very interesting. It turns out you can get statistical security. You can get protocols that are statistically secure. Of course, in particular, you can get protocols that are computationally secure because this is a weaker version of this one. But it turns out, and this is very interesting, you cannot get perfect security. So check this out. T less than in half on a passive adversary, you can get perfect security. But now if you want to support active adversaries, if you want to withstand active adversaries, then you cannot get perfect security. Still, statistical is pretty good. But it's just like to see the theoretical differences that we have between the two worlds. This is where the difference between T less than in half and T less than in third pops in. Because with T less than a third, you can get perfect security, even if the adversary is active. And in particular, you can get the others. So this is the picture of MPC. This is what we know about what is possible and what is impossible in MPC. And I think the main takeaway lesson is dishonest majority, you have to use computational assumptions, and therefore it's a bit slower because you have to rely on these hard problems and so on, and you have to settle with security with a board. Honest majority, you can get in better notions of privacy, like statistical or perfect, and you can get better output guarantees. That's essentially the breaking line I want you to remember. All right. And with this, I essentially conclude the first half of the talk. So far, we know some notions. We know passive versus active adversaries. We know dishonest versus honest majority, guaranteed output delivery, fairness, and all these different things. And now what I want to discuss during the second half is essentially some very, very basic multi-party protocols that it turns out to be, even though they are super basic, and hopefully you also get convinced of that, they are the seed, or they are like in the core of other constructions that are much more complex and much more practical. So let's get to it. The first protocol that I want to present is for two parties with passive security. Okay, from now on, everything's going to be passive. All right, because it's much easier to do than active. Again, what it means is that we don't need to worry about what happens if Alice doesn't send the right message. What happens if Bob doesn't send the right message? We don't need to care about that because they will send the right message. All right, so let's begin. Let's X and Y be the inputs from Alice and Bob. And let's say that the function they want to compute is this function that I'm writing here. It's the function that takes the two inputs and first subtract them, then adds them, and then multiplies them together. And it does this modulo some integer, right? We typically work modulo something because we want to have finite structures in MPC. It's like also in cryptography in general, you work at the level of bits, you work at the level of discrete structures. So that's why we take modulo an integer. All right, so this is the function we want to compute. The main ingredient here is something very simple that it has a very fancy name, but it's actually very simple, and it's called additive secret sharing. And we're going to say that Alice and Bob have a shared value Z, and we denote this by these brackets of Z, and this is a notation that is going to appear in the rest of the talk all the time, so it's good if you remember it. If the following happens, Alice has some Z1, Bob has some Z2, and the two numbers together add up to C. But each one independently is supposed to be random, so it's supposed to leak nothing about C. So I want you to get convinced that this simple construction guarantees that Alice doesn't know anything about the C, the value being hidden, and Bob doesn't know anything about C. The reason is simple again, like Alice only has Z1, which looks like a random number, like it's completely random, it's gibberish, it doesn't tell Alice anything about Z. And similarly, Bob doesn't have any knowledge about C because C2 also looks just random. Sure, when you combine the two together, they are very correlated. Their sum gives you C, and C may be something secret, something important, something sensitive. But by themselves, each piece separately doesn't tell you absolutely anything. And this very, very simple construction is actually at the core of pretty much every protocol you will see out there. So it's a very simple construction. I hope if there is any question about this, you can interrupt me at absolutely any time, because we're going to use it later on in the rest of this talk. But it's very simple. Just it's a way of getting a representation of a secret in such a way that Alice doesn't know what the secret is, Bob doesn't know what the secret is, but they together can get together and actually determine what the secret is. Okay, with this ingredient, how can we compute this function? How can we do it? So
next question.
Please.
Let's say I'm Bob. I set my Z2 to 0. If I know Z, don't I know Alice's Z1?
Sorry, hold on. So you said you're Bob and you said C2 to be 0, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you said C2 to be 0, and C1 is in this case, C1 would be Z, right? Because if C2 is 0, the only way in which they two can add up together to Z is that Z1 is Z, but you only know this part.
Oh, you mean I don't know Z?
Yeah, exactly. So the only way in which Bob will have Z2 as 0 is because Alice has a Z, and because it was designed like that for some reason. In fact, we're going to see in a second that this is something that can be used. But in general, this secret sharing, which Bob has it 0 and Alice has the actual secret, it only happens when you want Alice to know the secret. If you don't want Alice to know the secret, then you take this completely random and this one completely random. So it won't be 0, it will be something random. And it will be something random, but restricted to the sum being equal to your secret.
Okay.
Yep, so hopefully it becomes clear in a second, but the idea is if you don't want Alice nor Bob to learn the secret, you can solve it by just taking random and random. If you want one of them to know the secret, or if they can know the secret for some reason, then you can of course always take 0 and the secret here, and the sum will give you that. Hopefully when we use it, it becomes clearer. So this is how we're gonna use this secret sharing representation to compute this function. So I'm gonna do it here. So
by giving the one the knowledge of the secret. So let's say you give Alice the knowledge of a secret of Z. Are you putting the risk or the liability on that party?
I'm not sure I get the question.
Because now does Alice know that they know the secret, or is it just is?
Oh yeah, I guess if you do okay first, if Alice is not supposed to learn the secret and Bob sends somehow this information so that she can get the secret, right? Then I guess it's because first of all because Bob is malicious in that case. Bob is sending information that is not supposed to be sending. And if that happens, well, one or two things. So either Bob is sending Alice some information about the corrupt parties, which in our way of modeling things is fine because an honest party can learn something about the bad parties. It's like we can learn about the bad guys, but the bad guys can learn about us. Or Bob is sending information about, to Alice that Alice was not supposed to learn in the first place, and it's information about another honest party. But in that case, Bob could have learned that information himself. So that means that Bob will have breaking the protocol. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that will only happen if Bob is corrupt, and we're fine because corrupt parties, we're fine with learning information about them. Hopefully this protocol that I'm going to describe here, hopefully give you a better idea about how we use this in the concrete setting, and then maybe we sort these questions out. But please, of course, let me know if it's still not clear. So remember the function we want to compute. It was Z and W, sorry, it was X and Y. And the function was X minus Y, X plus Y, modulo M, but I'm going to be omitting modulo all the time. So think of this modulo something. This is the function. Let's write this function as some sort of graph. So it starts with X and Y. X is held by Alice, Y is held by Bob. And if they had the inputs in the clear, this is the way they will do it. First, they would add them together. And this way they will get X plus Y. Then they will subtract them together to get X minus Y. And then they will take these two guys, they will multiply them together. Let's give them names. Let's call this guy W, let's call this guy Z. And they send it here, and then the multiplication will multiply Z with W, which is essentially what we wanted. It's X plus Y times X minus Y. And this is the way you will compute this, like if you had the inputs in the clear. Well, the idea of MPC, or something we call secret sharing based MPC, is MPC based on secret sharing, on this idea of distributing a secret among several parties, is that instead of doing this, the parties can do the things as follows. So here you have Alice, and she has X. Here you have Bob, and Bob has Y. So the first thing we can do is that Alice can secret share X. And that's very simple, as was observed by the first person that asked the question. If Alice knows X and Bob knows, if Alice knows the secret, then a very trivial secret sharing is just X and 0. So X on the side of Alice and 0 on the side of Bob, because there's some sums up to X. So they have sharings of Y, and they also have of X, and they also have sharings of Y by Alice setting 0 as her share and Bob setting Y as his own share. So this is just the starting point. So they got shares of the inputs. I mean, very, very trivial shares, but still they got shares. Now, how do they get shares of X plus Y? Well, it turns out that this sharing is very nice. Let's give them more general names. Let's call this guy X1 is the share held, or XA is the share held by Alice, and XB is the share held by Bob. It can be 0 and it can be X, but let's give them more general names. And here on the right side, I'm going to write YA and I'm going to write YB. So Alice has YA and Bob has YB, and they together sum up to Y. So if you have XA and XB and they add up to X, and if you have YA and you have YB and they add up to Y, and you want two numbers that together add up to X plus Y, then you can just add together XA plus YA, and Alice knows this, and XB plus YB, Bob knows this. Voila, they have shares of X plus Y. So the way they can get shares of a sum is just by adding their shares from the inputs locally without talking to the other guy. Very simple observation. So they got shares of X plus Y, which are shares of Z, because I'm calling Z X plus Y. And you can convince yourself that if I do the same with subtraction, I also get, it also works. So if Alice takes her XA and subtract YA, and if Bob takes XB and subtract YB, then we get shares of the subtraction of the two secrets. So far so good. We started from the computation, and every time we find an operation, we try to get shares of the output. Remember, sharings are good because sharings guarantee that each individual party doesn't know anything about the secret unless it was supposed to learn about the secret. And the two parties together can reconstruct the secret. So far we are here. Now the challenge is, how do we get, like, from shares of Z, let's call them Z1 plus Z2. These are the two shares, they add up to Z. This one is C1 and this one is Z2. And here, let's call the shares of W. Sorry, I was using A and B. Let's be consistent and let's use A and B. So now the challenge is, from this share that Alice has and this share that Alice has, and the same for Bob, how do they get to shares of the product of the two secrets? And you may want to think about it, and you will realize that they cannot just simply multiply their shares. Like if Alice takes ZA and multiplies 2EWA, and Bob takes ZB and multiplies 2EWB, and they add up together these two products here, this will not give you Z times W. So they cannot just go ahead and multiply their two secrets together. So how do they deal with this? And this is essentially the core. I'm going to discuss now a protocol for this, but at least hopefully so far you get the idea. The idea is to start with secret shared inputs. So nothing is leaked about the input so far. And then in the sums or in the subtractions, operate locally so that you get also sharings of the corresponding sum or of the corresponding subtraction. And for the multiplications, do something that I'm going to show you in a second what it is. Do something to get shares of the product. And this way you do this, what we call gate by gate or operation by operation, until you reach the output. And once you have, let's say I already showed you how to do this part. So they got shares of the output. They can just reconstruct the output itself by just sending their shares to each other, because the two shares, when you sum them up, they give you the secret. So this is the general idea about how MPC based on secret sharing works. And I want to explain how to do this product, because this is the challenging part that we haven't been able to discuss. But this is the overall idea of MPC. Okay. Again, feel free to interrupt me at any time. I will do my best to clarify. So as I said, if you have shares of Z and W, you can sum and subtract, and that will give you shares of the corresponding sum of subtraction. That's pretty straightforward. But the challenge is multiplications, and multiplication will require some interaction. Like so far, they haven't been talking to each other. They have been Alice on her side, Bob on his side. Multiplication will require interaction. And this is this thing that I wrote in bold font is something you should remember is multiplication will always be the problem. Like additions are typically super easy to handle by just doing things locally, as we have explained. But multiplications will be much harder, and you can prove actually that they are the bottleneck, like they require communication. So let's discuss how to get shares of the product. This is the challenge again. You have shares of Z and shares of Y, of W, and you want to get shares of the product between these two. This is the thing that I didn't explain how to do in the previous drawing. They cannot just multiply the shares of Z and multiply the shares of W because that's not how it works, right? Like if I have Z being as ZA plus ZB, and if I have W as WA plus WB, if I multiply these two, then you get all sort of, you get ZA WA, good. You get ZB WB, good. But you also get these cross terms, ZA WB and ZB WA. Alice knows a part of this and Bob knows the other. So how do they deal with this? That's why it doesn't work. So to handle this, to deal with this problem, we use the following protocol. So let's assume for a second that we have something that we call in MPC multiplication triples. And it's good that you know what they are because they pop up everywhere, this concept of a multiplication triple. They're also known as Beaver triples because they were designed by Donald Beaver in the 80s. And the idea is the following. Let's assume for a moment that the parties have a triple of like three values that are secret shared. So that's the first condition. They have shares of A. So two values that add up to A, but they are random individually. Two values that add up to B and two values that add up to C, with the condition that C is the product of the first two. So they are correlated. They are not just random numbers. C has to be the product of the first two. And the first two are actually random and unknown to any party. So nobody knows what they have inside. They just know they're random. And let's assume we have this from the sky, like somebody gave this to us. It's completely random stuff. It's not depending on the inputs of the parties. It's random, but correlated, but random. If you have this, if the parties, Alice and Bob have this, then they can obtain shares of the product, which is what we want, as follows. So it's a two-step thing. So first, they're going to reconstruct Z minus A. So what do I mean by this? This is a subtraction. So remember, subtraction can be handled locally. So by just subtracting their shares, they can subtract Z and A. Remember, they have A from here because we're assuming we have it. And they reconstruct. By reconstructing, we mean just share the shares. I mean, send your share to the other party and the other party send their own share to you. And now you know the secret by just adding the two shares together. So now the parties learn D, which is Z minus A. Good. Do the same with E, which is W minus B. So now the party knows these two values. Remember that we want to keep Z hidden and we want to keep W hidden. Like we want to keep them secret because in our example from before, there were intermediate steps in the computation. We don't want just to leak them. We don't want to, we only want to open the output, but not the intermediate computation. So how is that? The parties here are learning D and they're learning E. Why is it secure? Because they depend on C and W. Well, the reason is because A is completely uniformly random and the same with B. So when you take a value that is sensitive, but you subtract or add a random element to it, the result will look random to it. This is like a one-time path. Again, we're doing all this mod M all the time. And that's why, like, if you don't do this mod M, if you do this over the integers, actually, it will fail. But because we do it mod M, you can prove that this is indeed the case. And because, yeah, now you have this privacy, you know that D and E don't leak anything, so you're fine to go. You can continue. And the next step in the protocol, after you reconstructed these two guys, is to compute this operation here. So let's take a closer look to what this is. This can be done because this is just like a secret share number times a constant. So it's this secret share number plus itself E times. So this is something they can do without talking to each other. They can always add shares together. The same here. This is adding a constant because, again, by constant, I mean like a public value. E times D is public because they revealed it to each other. So they can also add the constant very easily, and then they can add the share to it. And after they take this long combination, we can prove that this is equal to Z times W. And the reason is very simple, actually, because Z is the same as D plus A if you solve for Z here. W is the same as E plus B if you solve for W here. And if you do the sum, if you do these cross products, you will literally find this expression that we have here, where C, remember, is A times B. So this is a very, hopefully you find it simple. It's a simple protocol that allows parties to compute a product from shared inputs. So they have shared inputs and they get shares of the product. And that way they can finish the computation that we started before. So this is the general idea about how to get a multi-party computation with two parties. And it may look very simple. I really hope you find it simple because it's not using heavy math or anything. It's just like simple additions and subtractions. But it's actually, even though it's very simple, it's at the heart of all the constructions you may find today. So I think it's very interesting because of that. All right, so because these triples that we were assuming, they don't depend on the inputs, it suffices only to generate them. Like if you have a method to generate those multiplication triples, then you're done. That's the only missing step we have. Like if you rewind everything we did, the only thing that I never told you how to do is how to get these triples. I just said assume the existence of them, but I never told you how to get them. And I cannot, because that turns out to be like the bottleneck, like what a 40 pages paper takes care of is just developing these triples. These triples can be preprocessed. They don't depend on the inputs. So they can be computed way beforehand, before the computation starts. And we denote this by the offline, we call it the offline phase. So in the offline phase, this is also some terminology that you will hear a lot if you read about MPC or talk to people about MPC. Is like, oh, what is the offline phase? Is the computation part that doesn't depend on the parties' inputs. So on the actual salaries, let's say, or on the actual votes. It's something we can meet and we can compute this material, so these triples. And then once we have our inputs, we can start the actual computation. And this is typically the bottleneck. This will be way more expensive than the online phase. The online phase is the one where you take all the material you pre-processed here in the offline phase and you use it together with your inputs to get the computation of the function in a similar way as I just sketched in this big graph. So you start with the inputs, additions and subtractions. You just do it like locally. And whenever you find a multiplication, you do it with these triples as I just explained. And this is MPC for two parties. It's really simple and it's also, even though it's simple, as I said, is still like very useful. Because first it works, and second, it's actually used in practice. It's used for many practical protocols. All right, so that was for two parties, and that method can be generalized to more than two parties also. So it's not completely restricted to two parties. The last thing I want to talk about, yeah, please.
But how do you do the offline phase? Do you need a trusted party for that?
So yeah, that's a good question. So one way, of course, is let's use trusted party. So this trusted party will it will take care of sending this correlated information to the other two parties, to Alice and Bob, and nothing else. It can do this. It can do this 1 month in advance, send this information, and then go home, be destroyed. Like you can completely, it doesn't need to be involved later on. So we made progress. This is not the same trusted party as we had before. The same trusted party that actually sees the inputs. But it's still a trusted party nevertheless. So we can eliminate it. We can have a protocol between Alice and Bob where they can generate all this pre-processing material. But that protocol is usually very complex. One of the reasons why it has to be complex is because if you remember in the feasibility results, I said that you cannot have a protocol with perfect security in the dishonest majority setting. And two parties and one corruption is dishonest majority setting. And everything I've showed you so far is perfect. So wait, we're having a protocol with perfect security and two parties when I said that was impossible. And the reason is because all these heavy computations that come with computational assumptions and so on, all these will appear when you try to get this offline phase. So the offline phase will look ugly, it's super big, it's super complex. There are many ways of doing it. I'm going to provide some pointers later on. You can do it from homomorphic encryption. You can do it from something called oblivious transfer. You can do it from oblivious linear evaluation. I'm sorry, these names just sound like gibberish, but I'm just trying to say like that's where the core of the protocols is, how to get this preprocessing. So I'm not gonna get into that today, but that's the idea is that yes, we have protocols for that.
Thanks.
No problem. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is Shamir secret sharing. It's probably something you have already encountered before if you have been on this reading like blogs or something, and if not, it's something very useful to know in general. And we're gonna be working with 3 parties only, and t equal to 1. So in particular, we have honest majority. We have t less than n-half because t is 1 and n-half is 1.5. So this inequality holds. So we're going to be working in the dishonest majority setting. Everything I explained here actually generalizes to any n and to any t as long as t is less than n-half. But of course, I want it to be concrete so that it is easier to understand. So the recipe is the same. For how do we compute the function? Well, we start with the inputs. We secret share them. By secret sharing, again, we mean this idea of like sending a little piece to every single party so that all together can meet and actually get the output, but the adversary who is controlling maybe 1 party or maybe 2 parties or maybe 3, it doesn't learn anything about the underlying data. And then once you have these secret sharing schemes, you can proceed operation by operation. So additions will turn out to be local, so no interaction will be needed. And multiplications will require some clever protocol, but for Shamir secret sharing, the protocol will also be simple. And so that's why it suffices to have MPC secret sharing, to get MPC. So how is that Shamir secret sharing works? It works as follows. So the first thing, if you want to share a secret S using Shamir secret sharing, you do the following. You sample a random value C and you define the polynomial f of degree at most 1 that is given by S, the secret, plus C times X. X is a variable. So if you think about polynomials of degree 1 as lines in a plane, what this is saying is that literally you take S to be here because the polynomial at 0 gives you S. So you take the polynomial, you take the point, the line has to pass through this point, and then you choose the slope at random. So C is the slope of this line. So you choose it at random among all the possible slopes, you choose one at random. Let's say I choose this one. And this is your polynomial F. And the shares that P1 and P2 and P3 will get are the following. So P1 gets the polynomial evaluated at 1. So P1 gets essentially this point here. P2 gets this point here, and P3 gets this point here. And the secret is at the coordinate 0. Okay, this is how Shamir secret sharing works. And let's have some formal analysis in the next slide, but actually it's easier to analyze it here. So we want to claim that the adversary who is corrupting 1 party because t is equal to 1 doesn't learn the secret. And this is very easy because if you corrupt, for example, this party, so this is the only thing you only know this point. There are infinitely many lines that pass through this point. So the secret can be absolutely anything. Like I don't know anything about the secret. The same if I only know this guy or if I only know this guy. But if suddenly, instead of knowing 1, you know 2 guys, you know maybe this one and you also know this one, you know the secret now because now you can simply get the line that goes through these 2 points, see where it intersects the y-axis, and that's the secret. So this is Shamir secret sharing for n equal to 3 and t equal to 1, and it can be, as I said, generalized to degree to any t and any n as long as t is less than n-half. And it's a very useful primitive. We use it all the time, not only for MPC, also for distributed storage. You want to distribute a file among several servers in such a way that if some servers dies, you don't lose your file, but still you're not doing the naive thing of just sending the file in the clear to every server. You still get some kind of privacy. So it's a very useful scheme to know. And this is how it works. This is the formal analysis that I just mentioned. And now we're going to have linearity. So if the parties just add up their shares together, so if they have shares of C and shares of W and they just literally sum them up, so F1 plus G1 and F2 plus G2 and F3 plus G3, you can see that they correspond to evaluations of a different polynomial, which is the sum of the 2 original polynomials at the different points. And the polynomial has degree 1. So this is essentially a sharing. If you remember, a sharing looks like the secret here. The secret has to be in this position, and this is the random slope. This thing here is the random slope. Well, if you add up your shares together, you can see the result follows the same syntax. So this means that the scheme is linear, or it's like additive sharings. If you want sharings of a sum, you just sum your sharing together, and that's fine. So good, that's a good start. Now for multiplication though, that doesn't quite hold. If you take your share of 1 and you multiply it to G1, sure, they correspond to H1, H2, and H3 and so on for a different polynomial, which is the product of the two polynomials. This is the product between Z plus CX and W plus DX. Now the problem is that the degree of this polynomial is 2. So to constitute a sharing, this has to be a polynomial of degree 1, not a polynomial of degree 2. But we can actually fix this issue because of the following property. I don't have time to check it, but yeah, so these are not valid shares of the product, even though the product lies in the free coefficient. It's not a sharing because it's not the right degree. But we can still be hopeful, because if you check the math offline, you will see that h of 1 times 3 minus 3 times h of 2 plus h3, if you do this computation, it literally gives you h of 0. And h of 0 is e times w. And how can we exploit this? We can exploit this formula to get an actual multiplication protocol as well. So let me explain this part to you. I hope everything is clear so far. Basically, addition holds, but multiplication doesn't hold because the degree doesn't match. But even though the degree doesn't match, we still have a relation between the shares and the secret. And that would be enough. Let me show you why that is enough. Let me describe to you a protocol for multiplication. So the starting point is that the parties have shares of Z, which are evaluations of a polynomial of degree 1. They have shares of W, and they proceed as follows. First, each party multiplies its own share, F1, F2, and so on, depending on the party, times the ones of G. And as we saw before, this corresponds to the polynomial that is the product of the two polynomials evaluated at I. So far, so good, just like the same thing we did before. Then the next step is that each party is going to secret share. So I have this value HI. Sorry, I have this value HI, which only I know because it's the multiplication of my own shares, P1, let's say, so I know H1. But now what I will do is that I will send to all the other parties shares of my value. So I will act as the dealer, as the generator of shares. So I will take my value, I will treat it as a secret, and I will give all of you, the other two participants, I will give you shares of my secret. So now the parties get shares of H1 because P1 gave it to the other parties. They get shares of H2 and they get shares of H3. Why is it useful? Because remember the formula that I wrote before. 3 times H1 minus 3 times H2 plus 3 times plus H3 gives you the product of the two secrets. Well, the parties just need to do the exact same formula, but with the shares that they just got. And this is fine because this is linear. So this 3 times this is completely possible. It's just adding this to itself 3 times. This is also this to itself 3 times. And this is just this thing on its own. So you can take this linear combination, this linear operation, and that gives you shares of the product. It's a pretty clever protocol, I think, and it's very simple to explain. Maybe what is hard is to see the generalization, because how did we get this formula? This formula here is not trivial. This formula follows from the fact that 2t plus 1 is less than or equal to n. In this case, t is equal to 1, so 3 is less than or equal than n, that is 3. So you can apply what is called Lagrange interpolation to get this formula, but it always works. It's just that I focus on the particular case and I brought it like magic, but it actually, you can always find this formula. Okay, so this gives you a multiplication protocol, and with it, it gives you multiparty computation, because that's essentially the only missing operation that we have. Okay, so now I want to provide you some reference. I'm now going downhill like towards finishing my talk, so please don't worry if you think this is taking too long. I'm just about to reach the conclusion remarks. So some references. This is the talk is being recorded, so of course you will have a chance to read this offline. But from the Spitz family, Spitz is quite like a famous name if you have heard about MPC. It's just like it's quite a family of protocols that are set in the dishonest majority setting, so t less than n. In particular, they work for two parties. And there are all this line of protocols, typically one improving over the previous one, and they are based on different assumptions. Somebody asked before about how do you deal with the preprocessing, and of course, what I'm saying is that all of them have the exact same online phase that we showed here. They look exactly the same, and the only difference is how to get these multiplication triples that we talked about. For example, this one does it with something called linearly homomorphic encryption. This one does it with also linearly homomorphic encryption or somewhat homomorphic encryption as well. This one does it with something called oblivious transfer. So nothing, it's not very important for you to know, but just to understand that the reason why we have so many protocols is because you can have different protocols based on different computational problems, based on different primitives and so on. Now, Shamir-based protocols also have like a lot of papers based on them. The one I presented here is the so-called BGW protocol. It's from the 80s, but I don't remember exactly what date, what exact year. But it has seen a lot of improvement. So we have this famous protocol, it's called the N07 because of the authors and the year. So this protocol is very simple to understand. So if you really want to understand the techniques I explained here in a bit more general, in a bit more of a general context, I invite you to read this paper. It's pretty well written and also simple to understand. You have other works that also explore this, some more practical ones. This is an actual implementation as well as this one. So you're more than welcome to check this out. And then finally, I want to say that if you don't want to have a protocol for any number of parties, you don't care about 100 parties, you don't care about 40, you care about 3 parties, let's say, or 4 parties, then you also have protocols that focus on this explicitly and get better numbers than the general ones. Here are just some references for you to check out, but these are these general protocols. Okay, so now let me go and conclude. I had this application if I had time for you, but I think I won't have time, so let me just skip it. Okay, so now I want to reach the conclusions. What have we seen on this talk? So MPC techniques allow you a set of parties to compute any function without leaking anything but the output, in particular, keeping the inputs secure. We have different protocols depending on the type of adversary. We talked about active, passive. We talked about the corruption bound, like how many parties is the adversary allowed to corrupt. We talk about perfect security, statistical security, and computational security. And there is this natural question, of course, because I understand a lot of people in this audience, on top of being interested in the theory, so maybe interested also on the practical aspects of this, is how practical is this actually? And I had some application that I didn't have the time to check into, but for some applications, it's actually very possible. But the answer, as many of the answers to many questions in life, is it depends. So how practical is this? Well, is 2 seconds a lot for your application? Or what about 1 minute or 2 hours or 5 days? Depending on whatever you want to compute, I can get you a protocol that can take 1 week to one protocol that takes 3 seconds. So it completely depends on the type of computation that you want to carry out. Do you need active security? Do you really need to enforce that even if the adversary misbehaves, the protocol remains secure? Or is it enough if you have passive security? Or can you use a third party, for example, to get you the triples, the multiplication triples? It's not, this trusted party won't be trusted with the actual secrets. It will be only trusted to please generate this data correctly, and that's it. Is this enough for you? So all these questions, depending on the setting, lead to more efficient or less efficient protocols. Are the parties well connected? This is a lot of interaction. If one guy is in India and the other guy is in England and the other guy in the US, it's going to be much more difficult to get an MPC protocol to run effectively. So all these things makes it like very hard to give a concrete answer. All I can say for sure is that we're doing much better today than 10, 20, or 30 years ago. And some applications, unfortunately, are still out of reach. So for example, if someone from a very ambitious company goes and tells you, I want an MPC protocol to train a very complex machine learning model on hundreds or millions of data, like I can tell you, no. Like I can today, and hopefully I will be watching this talk some years later and say, oh yeah, I just said no, but now today we can do it. But today we cannot do it. But some other applications can be already considered. And a very like an example that I gave, I couldn't discuss, but it's the example I wanted to discuss is when you have secure image analysis via neural network. So something you want to predict whether or not array X of some organ or something, does it have like cancer or something? You can do it with a neural network, for example. And if you don't care about the prediction taking 5 seconds, 10 seconds, for example, then, which of course makes sense, the doctor can wait for 5 seconds, then we actually have solutions for that. So it all depends on the application. MPC has been deployed in practical scenarios. So it's not like a purely theoretical tool. It has been used in Denmark in 2008 by people in the group where I work right now, to actually find agreement between several farmers of sugar beets to find to decide on the price of the sugar beet for the next year. It had been used to evaluate to get the salaries from several companies in Boston, from men and women, to get the different disparities in gender. The companies didn't want to reveal their data directly, but if they do it in an MPC fashion, they were willing to do it. So that was very nice. And also they applied in Estonia for tax fraud detection. There are many, many applications, and I actually wrote a small blog about, for example, the applications to machine learning, and here is a link to it. So applications to machine learning, to e-voting, to secure statistics, databases. There is like a lot of things, and actually, this is reaching the practicality because we have a lot of frameworks that you can go out, they're open source, you can go and check them out. They are well documented and they allow you to compute any function, like absolutely any function out of the box. You don't need to care about how MPC works. You just write your function and you get a secure computation for it. So all this, PySIF, by the way, is focused on machine learning, but it's still worth mentioning. The same as TF encrypted, but you get all these nice frameworks that take this to practicality. Companies are getting interested on this, like either from the research side or also from the practical side. So Facebook has a very nice framework for MPC with machine learning, same with Microsoft, same with Intel as well. So you have like all these different sort of promotion from different companies. Visa has like very good researchers in this area as well. And some other companies are already pushing this as a product. So this is just a list of some. I'm not advocating for any of them, by the way. This is not like a campaign. I'm just showing that this is like reaching practicality up to the point in which you can generate like an impact with this. So I find it to be very cool. I have some further reading for you. In particular, I have this crash course, which is the extended version of this talk, let's say. It's a series on Medium and it's found on my personal Medium. You can check it out. It's in progress, but it already has like 6 parts. So you can check out the constructions I've given here, and much more. Active security, for example, it's all written there. Some other links also follow in this list. And some FAQ that I usually get with this type of talks. I only talked about additions and multiplications, how to deal with more general functions. So what if what I want is the comparison function, which is not a sum or a multiplication, is something more different. So a theoretician will tell you that multiplications and additions are enough to compute any function, because that's true. You can always define any finite function. You can write it as a polynomial or as a combination of additions and multiplications. But as a more practical oriented guy, I will tell you that you're right. I only consider these 2 things. And in practice, we care about having other more complex things like comparison. You want to compare 2 numbers that are secret, or you want to truncate something. You want to work with real numbers. You want to work with several different kind of structures. We have specific constructions for those. So how do we deal with more general functions? We develop soft protocols that deal with these operations that appear over and over and over again. What about active security? Well, yeah, I didn't say anything about this, but the reference I gave you are typically actively secure. They are much harder than passive security, but still there is to follow. Is it actually practical? Well, I hope I actually said a little bit about this. So yes, in some settings. And well, this one also is very important. I didn't talk about differential privacy, homomorphic encryption, or garbled circuits, which are other words that you might have heard. And all of them are related to this field of let's compute on secret data. Let's compute on data that is not known. And all of them are super different. So differential privacy is this thing, is completely orthogonal. You are computing a function securely, but you're revealing the output. How do you know that the output is not leaking anything about the input? And this is what differential privacy, this is where differential privacy comes in. You start adding noise to this output to make sure that even if you only reveal the output, you're not leaking anything about the inputs from the output. So it's completely orthogonal. Homomorphic encryption is this technology where you can encrypt data and compute on it, like on in encrypted form, without any communication or anything, literally in your computer, just a bunch of encryptions and computing on it. Well, it's much more inefficient than using MPC for large computations, but like way more inefficient for certain range of applications, all right? Still, in MPC, we use homomorphic encryption a lot, but if you want to compute a very large function and if you have a way of doing it distributedly and the parties are well connected, I will advise to use MPC because it's typically like much faster and much easier to implement. Homomorphic encryption is still very useful, and as years pass by, I assume it's going to get more and more efficient. All right, and finally, garbled circuit is another way of doing MPC. It's not based on secret sharing. It's based on, well, garbling a circuit is a completely different approach. I won't get into detail on this. Just wanted to fill in these holes that some people may feel I left out. With this, I think I'm ready. And visit our blog. Is called Applied MPC. And you will find several interesting posts about MPC, practical, theoretical, and everything you want. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thanks, Daniel. That was amazing. Let me stop the recording.